Again, once thought to be fungi, DNA and genetic analysis show that they actually arose from a different evolutionary lineage and are not really closely related to fungi. They are within the protist group. So there are two distinct types of slime molds. There's what are called plasmodial slime molds and cellular slime molds. But superficially, they do have an appearance like fungus or fungi. So the plasmodial slime molds, they have a feeding amoeba mass that grows and grows, especially as they obtain food, and that's called a plasmodium. And they extend pseudopodia, right, false feet, along leaf litter and other decaying material on the forest floor as they're looking for organic material to digest. The cellular slime molds have solitary amoeboid cells. Here we go. Amoeboid type cells that feed independently. However, when food is in short supply, the cells gather together to form a colony, kind of like a slug that can creep around and function as a single unit. Oh, sorry. And then that colony can form a reproductive structure to release cells that will become amoeboid cells. So slime molds are pretty interesting and a really unique group of protists. Okay, so let's look at the photosynthetic protists, the algae. There's unicellular ones and colonial ones, and actually multicellular ones as well, as we'll see. So the algae contain the protist, the photosynthetic protist, and the cyanobacteria, the photosynthetic bacteria, are included within the algae. So the algae is just a general name, okay, because the protist is one taxonomic grouping, and the bacteria is its own domain, right? Domain bacteria. So the photosynthetic protists and the photosynthetic cyanobacteria are grouped into this general category called the algae. And they photosynthesize, and the photosynthesis provides nutrients for them, the protists and the cyanobacteria, but also supports food chains in freshwater and marine ecosystems. So it's kind of like the algae serve a similar purpose as the photosynthetic plants on land, the base of the food chain. So photosynthetic algae in what are called phytoplankton that we'll talk about photosynthesize, provide nutrients for themselves, right, carbohydrates, but also provide nutrients for small swimming organisms in the water that are heterotrophic, the zooplankton. And those are really small. They're eaten by small fish. Small fish are eaten by medium-sized fish. Medium-sized fish are eaten by large fish. So the phytoplankton are mostly unicellular algae that basically just float around in the water. Planktonic or plankton is something that basically just floats around in the water. And they photosynthesize, again, providing the base of the food chain in aquatic environments. So if you have a dirty fish tank, some of that green sludge, or the canals that you might have in our part of the world, or ponds or streams or rivers, the green sludge type material, that mostly is algae. So dinoflagellates are a type of algae. There are biflagellates. They have two flagella, and they have interesting characteristic shapes, and they have an external covering made up of cellulose, and it's a abundant component of the phytoplankton. Some are important symbionts, right? Symbiotic association with the reef-building corals that rely on the dinoflagellates to provide needed nutrients. Diatoms are another member of the phytoplankton. And they have a glassy silica shells that are really interesting, and they fit together as two pieces, kind of like if you imagine the lid on a box, a shoebox, and that's that external component of the diatoms. And there's multiple shapes of them, but again, they're photosynthetic and members of the phytoplankton. And many of the ancient diatoms, well, first of all, diatoms help store food reserves as a lipid oil, and that helps them float in the phytoplankton. And then that oil in the ancient diatoms, when they died and settled down to the ocean floor and got covered up, they became an important component of oil deposits, right, or fossil fuels. Not all of the fossil fuels, but the diatoms are an important component of fossil fuels in terms of oil deposits. So just a little video here of diatoms moving around. And that's these here that are kind of golden in color. Yeah. Nothing special here, just showing them moving a little bit. Okay, let's move on to green algae, named for the green chloroplasts that they have. So unicellular green algae flourish in many freshwater lakes and ponds. Again, the green scum I was talking about are a type of algae, specifically mostly green algae. And then green algae can also form colonial groups or shapes or forms. And volvox is a common one or well-known one where they form kind of a hollow ball of cells. And if you zoom in, it's an aggregation of many flagellated individual cells that form this colonial type organism called volvox. And then let's move on to the seaweeds, which are fairly common and fairly well known. So seaweeds are large multicellular marine algae that grow on some surface, rocky surface, or wooden pylons on piers, for example. They can even attach to the underside as of boats. They have a plant-like form, shape, but they're not plants, and this is due to convergent evolution because they have structures that are photosynthetic, and the structures reach up towards the surface of the water or just reach upwards, and they kind of have a leafy structure, again, to provide a surface structure to harness sunlight because they're photosynthetic. So seaweeds are classified into three main groups, mostly based on the type of pigments. Photosynthetic pigments, these are molecules that harness sunlight energy. Remember, we talked about pigments in our photosynthesis chapter. So based on the type of pigments they have in their chloroplasts, there's green algae, green pigments, red algae, kind of a reddish brown pigments, and then the brown algae, more of a brown or green-brown pigment. And the brown algae, some of the brown algae form the large kelp. So the kelp beds or the kelp forests we have along the California coast. If you've ever been to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, big kelp tank, that's not a plant. That's actually a type of seaweed, brown algae, which is actually a protist. And as you can see here, some of the algae, normally the red algae, is used in some foods, like the wrapping in for seaweed, that green wrapping. It's actually an algae that we're eating. Agar plates for culturing microbes and bacteria in labs, research labs, that kind of gelatinous material called agar. Agar is obtained from brown algae, harvested on an industrial scale. And that's it for this chapter.